Welcome to the channel Urban Nightmares. Now you're going to hear the story of a motel in the middle of nowhere. The desert seemed infinite, a vast expanse of barren land and rocks stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the road shrouded in impenetrable darkness. Julia, my wife, sat beside me in the car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, squeezing them harder each time the tension between us increased. The trip, which had initially been a getaway to reconnect, was turning into an uncomfortable experience. The silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken words and buried resentments. The GPS had lost signal a while back, leaving only a straight line on the screen indicating that we were still on the right path, though it was beginning to feel like a never-ending trap. The minutes dragged on, and the road remained deserted. We had left behind any trace of civilization miles ago, and a growing sense of desperation settled in the pit of my stomach. "Carlos, how much longer until we reach somewhere?" Julia's voice broke the silence, her tone reflecting a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. I glanced at the odometer, calculating that we had driven at least 100 kilometers since the last gas station, without encountering any sign of life. "I don't know, Julia," I replied with a sigh, trying to keep the calm in my voice. "There must be something soon. We can't be that far from everything." But deep down, something told me we were farther away than it seemed, as if we were in some kind of limbo, trapped on a road leading nowhere. My thoughts grew darker as the car continued down the worn asphalt. And then, as if fate had decided to throw us a lifeline, we saw a sign in the distance. The headlights illuminated the worn-out letters. "Motel the Wayfarer, 2 kilometers. "There, a motel," I announced, feeling a wave of relief that contrasted with the growing fear settling in my chest. But Julia didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the sign, as if something about it unsettled her. "Do you think it's safe?" she finally asked, her voice filled with doubt. "We don't have a choice," I replied. "We can't keep driving in the middle of nowhere. We need to rest." The car slowly made its way down the dirt road leading to the motel. As we approached, the yellowish lights of the building emerged in the dimness, revealing a small, outdated structure. It was a single-story motel, with a dozen rooms lined up next to each other, all with doors facing the outside. The reception area was a run-down structure, with a flickering neon sign that barely illuminated the place's name. There was something inherently unsettling about the way the light flickered, as if it was struggling to stay on amidst the surrounding darkness. We pulled up in front of the reception and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was overwhelming, broken only by the whisper of the wind blowing through the desert. I got out of the car, and the air felt thick, laden with an oppressive sensation I couldn't quite identify. Julia followed me, her footsteps echoing on the gravel as we approached the reception door. She didn't let go of my hand, and her firm grip told me more than any words could. When I pushed the reception door open, the squeak of the hinges shattered the silence like a sharp scream. Inside, the place was almost in darkness, illuminated only by a lamp on the counter. A middle-aged man, with a gaunt face and deep circles under his eyes, sat behind the counter. His expression was neutral, almost indifferent, while his eyes scrutinized us with a coldness that sent shivers down my spine. "Room for 2?" he asked in a low, raspy voice, almost a whisper. Something about his tone struck me as odd, but I tried to ignore it. "Yes, please," I responded, trying to sound as casual as possible, though I felt the nervousness growing inside me. While the man searched for the keys, I took the opportunity to glance around the place. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, with damp stains in some corners. There was a sense of abandonment, as if the place had been forgotten by time. The man placed the key on the counter, his eyes fixed on me as he did. "Room 7, he said, and then, in a tone that chilled me to the bone, he added, "Enjoy your stay and don't open the door to anyone." My first reaction was confusion. "What do you mean by that?" The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes shifted toward the window, where the night seemed to grow denser and more oppressive. "It's just a rule of the place," he finally said. "For your safety, don't open the door, no matter who knocks." I felt a chill run down my spine. Julia, beside me, looked at me with concern, her eyes reflecting the same fear that was beginning to settle in me. "Okay," I finally replied, taking the key with trembling hands. "Thank you." We left the reception and walked toward our room in silence. The atmosphere around the motel was heavy, as if it was imbued with something ancient and malevolent. Every creak beneath our feet, every whisper of the wind, seemed to amplify our unease. When we reached room 7, I inserted the key into the lock and pushed the door open. The interior was as grim as the rest of the motel, a double bed with a mattress that seemed to have seen better days, tattered curtains hanging lazily from a crooked rod, and a musty smell that permeated the air. Julia entered after me, looking around with barely contained disgust. "It's not exactly the Ritz," I tried to joke, but my voice sounded forced, and Julia didn't respond. We settled in as best we could, and after a quick shower we got into bed. The exhaustion finally began to drag me towards sleep, but there was something in the atmosphere that wouldn't let me fully relax. Every little noise, every shadow on the walls, seemed to have a life of its own. I closed my eyes, trying to push aside the discomfort, but sleep remained elusive. I could feel Julia beside me, her breathing shallow and quick, signaling that she wasn't sleeping either. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed through the door. My eyes flew open, feeling a surge of adrenaline course through my body. Julia woke up too, her breath catching for a moment as we stayed still, listening. "Carlos," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone knocked on the door." Fear took hold of me. I remembered the receptionist's words. "Don't open the door to anyone." I tried to reason, telling myself it must be a mistake, that someone had the wrong room. But deep down, something told me that wasn't the case. Another knock, louder this time. The sound reverberated through the small room, echoing in my ears like a persistent echo. Julia clung to my arm, her eyes filled with terror. "We're not going to open, right?" Her voice was barely a whisper, loaded with fear. I shook my head, unable to speak. My mind was racing in all directions, searching for a rational explanation, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to find one. The third knock was different, more intense, as if someone was determined to get in. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I slowly got out of bed, making no noise, and walked to the door, making sure it was securely locked with the latch. "Who's there?" I asked in the firmest voice I could muster, but there was no response. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the knocks. Julia and I remained motionless, waiting for something to happen. And then we heard the sound that froze the blood in our veins. The doorknob began to turn slowly, as if someone on the other side was trying to open the door. "Carlos." Julia was trembling, her eyes filling with tears as panic enveloped her. "Please don't open the door." "I won't," I murmured, feeling my own fear mix with hers. The doorknob kept turning, then stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't a silence of relief. It was one full of tension, as if the threat was still present, waiting. Suddenly, a different sound broke the silence. It was a scratching, soft at first, but then stronger, as if long, sharp nails were clawing at the wood of the door. The sound was unbearable, piercing, and echoed in the small room like a sharp scream. Julia started crying. Her sobs were soft, as if she was afraid to make any noise that might attract the attention of whatever was outside. I was paralyzed, unable to think clearly. All I knew was that we couldn't open that door. Something or someone was out there, and it wasn't just a simple visitor. The scratching continued for what seemed like an eternity, each second stretching like an endless torture. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even deeper, as if the room had been enveloped in a shroud of absolute darkness. Did it leave?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. Slowly, I approached the window and slightly drew back the curtains to peek outside. I saw nothing, just the dark silhouette of the desert stretching beyond the small parking lot. But something told me we weren't alone. I felt a presence, a shadow hidden in the darkness, watching us. The air in the room felt thick, almost unbreathable. The receptionist's warning kept echoing in my mind. What had he really tried to tell us? What did he know that we didn't? Several minutes passed in silence, both of us too scared to speak or move. Finally, exhaustion began to take over, and although the fear was still present, Julia's body relaxed a bit and she fell asleep in my arms. But I couldn't sleep. My eyes remained fixed on the door, waiting for any other sound, any sign that the danger was still there. The night seemed endless, and every second passed like torture, stretching into the darkness that surrounded us. Suddenly, the sound of the room's phone made us both jump. The sharp ring echoed in the heavy air, violently breaking the silence. Julia clung to me, terror reflected in her eyes. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone and picked it up. "Hello?" My voice was a barely audible whisper. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. A silence so deep I could hear my own breathing and the thumping of my heart in my ears. "Hello?" I repeated, a little louder this time. And then a voice, soft and barely audible, whispered on the other end of the line, "You're not alone." The phone cut off immediately, leaving us once again in the oppressive darkness and silence of the room. I felt a chill run through my entire body, and for a moment, everything in me wanted to run away, leave that cursed place behind. But reason kept me tied to the room, afraid of what might be waiting outside. Julia was pale. Fear had left her almost immobile. "Carlos, please, let's get out of here," she pleaded, her words broken by terror. I nodded, knowing we couldn't stay a second longer in that place. But just as we were about to get up from the bed, a sharp noise made us stop. It was a metallic sound, followed by a creak. Something was at the door. My heart began to pound uncontrollably. I got up slowly, cautiously approaching the door. The doorknob was turning slowly again, but this time, something else was happening. I could hear a whisper, a barely perceptible voice coming from the other side of the door, as if someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "Carlos, what's happening?" Julia was panicking, her eyes frantically scanning the room, looking for an escape. "I don't know," I replied, feeling fear grip my chest like a clenched fist. "I don't know what's happening." The doorknob stopped turning, but the whisper continued. It was hypnotic, and despite the terror I felt, a part of me wanted to listen more, wanted to open the door and see who was on the other side. But something inside me, a primal instinct, told me not to, that opening that door would be a fatal mistake. Finally, the whisper stopped, and the room plunged back into a deadly silence. The darkness seemed denser than ever, as if the very air had become heavy and cold. Julia moved closer to me, and without needing to say it, we both knew it was time to leave. Quickly, we began packing our things, moving as cautiously as possible to avoid making noise. I knew something was lurking, something watching us from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't shake the feeling that if we made one wrong move, if we made too much noise, whatever was outside would find us. When we were almost ready to leave, I heard a sound behind me. I turned quickly, expecting the worst, but there was nothing. Just the room, as grim as before. But something had changed. I felt we weren't alone in that place, that something had been watching us all along. Finally, with my heart in my throat, we headed for the door. I paused for a moment, listening, making sure there were no more noises before slowly opening it. Outside, the night was dark and silent, but there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the very desert was holding its breath. We left the room, and I closed the door behind us, making sure it wasn't left open. The motel was completely silent, and the sign's lights continued to flicker, casting strange shadows on the ground. As we walked toward the car, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something invisible was watching us from the darkness. We reached the car and got in quickly. Julia was trembling, and her eyes kept darting around, as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows at any moment. I started the engine, and the car's roar was almost a relief amidst the oppressive silence. As we drove away from the motel, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a brief instant, I thought I saw a figure standing at the door of our room. A shadow barely visible watching us as we drove away. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. We drove in silence, the fear still nestled in our hearts. I couldn't stop thinking about what the receptionist had said, about the words whispered on the other end of the phone. "You're not alone." Those words kept echoing in my head, like a warning, or maybe a truth we didn't want to accept. Finally, the dawn began to break on the horizon, bathing the desert in a soft light. Julia was exhausted, her head resting against the window, but I couldn't relax. I felt that even though we had left the motel behind, something was following us. Something that had awakened in the darkness of that night and was now accompanying us on our journey. As the sun rose, illuminating the world with its golden light, the feeling of danger began to fade. But I knew it was just an illusion. What we had experienced in that motel was not something that could be explained with logic or reason. It was something that transcended human understanding, something ancient and malevolent that had been waiting for a long time. And although we had escaped, I knew we were not safe. Something had broken that night, a door had been opened, and now we were exposed to something greater, something we couldn't comprehend. As I drove, I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that night, that experience, would haunt us forever. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now you're going to hear the story of a killer in the bathroom. The trip had been long, much longer than we had expected. The car I had rented for this work trip seemed to be functioning well when we left the city, but as we drove deeper into the countryside, it began to show signs of fatigue. A persistent knocking sound in the engine forced us to slow down, and soon we realized we wouldn't reach our destination that night. "Damn it," muttered Robert from the passenger seat, hitting the dashboard in frustration. This wasn't part of the plan, was it? I didn't respond immediately, focused on keeping the car running while anxiously scanning the horizon for a place to stay the night. No, it wasn't. But we need to find somewhere to sleep. We can't keep going like this. Robert and I were co-workers at a consulting firm sent to a remote town for an important client meeting. The deserted road and lack of cell service only heightened the sense of isolation, and though neither of us said it out loud, we were both nervous. Then, like an apparition in the darkness, I saw a sign that announced a motel just off the road. The large, faded letters seemed to promise a respite, though the peeling paint and flickering light suggested the place had seen better days. "There it is. A motel," I pointed out, and Robert followed my direction with a mix of relief and suspicion. "I hope they have a decent room," he muttered. But we didn't have another choice. The car was barely holding on. We pulled into the small parking lot, and the engine let out a metallic sigh as I turned it off. The building was a rectangular, single-story structure with a dozen doors lined up in front of us. The only other vehicle was an old, rusty pickup truck, making me wonder how many guests there were that night. The sign's lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the motel walls. "Well, at least it's not full," I joked, trying to lighten the tension I felt in my chest. Robert managed a tired smile, but his expression remained distrustful. We got out of the car and walked toward the small reception, a cubicle with a frosted glass window that was dimly lit from within. I rang the bell on the counter, and an older man with a weary look and an unkempt grey beard appeared behind the glass. "Any rooms available?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though something about the atmosphere made me uneasy. The man stared at us for a second that felt longer than necessary before nodding. "Yes, we have rooms. Number 5 is clean. $20 for the night." Robert pulled out the cash and slid it under the glass. The man took the bills without a word and handed us the key. "Enjoy your stay," he said, though his tone was anything but warm. It almost sounded like a warning. I took the key and we headed to room number 5. The door creaked open, revealing a modest but clean interior. The carpet was a bit worn, and the wallpaper had started to peel in places, but it was the best we could hope for under the circumstances. "Well, it's not that bad," Robert said, throwing himself onto one of the 2 beds. "At least it's better than sleeping in the car." I nodded, though the feeling of unease didn't leave me. There was something about this place that didn't sit right, something in the silence that kept me on edge. But maybe it was just the accumulated fatigue. We needed rest before tomorrow's meeting. "I'm going to take a shower," I said, heading to the small attached bathroom. The bathroom door was old, with chipped paint and a doorknob that looked like it was about to fall off. As I closed it behind me, the sound echoed in the room, and for a moment I thought it was the only noise I had heard since we arrived. The shower water was surprisingly hot, and as I let it wash over me, I started to relax a bit. Steam filled the small space, and my thoughts began to fade into the mist. But then, something snapped me out of my reverie. A sound, a soft murmur almost inaudible coming from the room. I turned off the water and listened. The murmur continued, a kind of childish humming, like a little girl singing a lullaby. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the room. Just Robert and me. I slowly opened the bathroom door, letting the steam spill into the room, enveloping it in a haze. Robert was sitting on the bed, motionless, with his eyes wide open. He stared at me, and in his expression I saw the same fear I was feeling. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to find words. The song continued, a soft and monotonous hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Where's it coming from?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was coming from the bathroom, the place where I had been just moments before. Robert stood up slowly, his movements cautious, as if he were walking on unstable ground. We approached the bathroom door, and the sound became clearer, sharper. It was a little girl's voice singing an old repetitive melody. "This doesn't make sense," Robert muttered, his eyes fixed on the bathroom door. "There's no one else here, it's just you and me." "I know," I replied, though every fiber of my being wanted to deny what was happening. "But the song, it's in the bathroom." We looked at each other, and I saw the determination in his eyes. We couldn't ignore what was happening. With a mix of fear and resolve, I reached out for the doorknob and slowly turned it. The bathroom was exactly as I had left it, small, damp, with walls covered in faded yellow tiles. But the voice was still there, humming that damn song, though now it felt more distant, as if it were trapped within the walls. "This can't be," I murmured, looking around, searching for something to explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the bathroom and that eerie, unsettling song. Robert took a step back, his face as pale as a sheet of paper. "We have to leave," he said, his voice laced with fear. "I don't care what's going on here, but I'm not staying to find out." I was about to agree with him when something in the bathroom mirror caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just my reflection distorted by the steam, but then I realized I wasn't alone. There was a figure behind me. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and thin, holding something shiny in his hand. My eyes widened as I quickly turned, but there was no one there. The bathroom was empty and the singing had stopped. "Robert, let's get out of here," I shouted, my voice filled with panic. But when I looked at Robert, I saw that he was no longer in the room. Panic gripped me, and I ran to the door, hoping to find Robert waiting for me outside. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Robert had vanished. Darkness closed in around me, and the silence was oppressive. My thoughts were chaotic, and I struggled to focus. All I could think about was that figure in the mirror and the little girl's voice. I decided to leave the motel and find help. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had seen. Robert was in danger, and I knew it. I ran to the parking lot, but the rusty pickup truck we had seen earlier was also gone. The place was completely deserted, and the road, which had once seemed like an escape route, now felt like a black ribbon leading to nowhere. "Robert!" I shouted, my voice echoing into the night, but there was no response. Despair began to set in. I didn't know what to do or where to go. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that bathroom. I couldn't face what I had seen. My thoughts were interrupted by a noise behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see Robert, but instead I saw a man, the man from the mirror. He was standing there in the darkness, watching me with an expression that sent chills down my spine. In his hand he held a long, sharp knife, the blade stained with something dark that reflected the starlight. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but then my survival instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I turned and started running, with no direction, only knowing that I had to get away from that man, from that place. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but when I finally stopped, I realized I was lost. The road was no longer in sight, and the motel had disappeared into the distance. The silence around me was absolute, and panic gripped me again. I tried to orient myself, to remember the direction I had come from, but it was useless. I was trapped in the darkness, with no idea where I was or how to get out. Then, a sound broke the silence. A soft, familiar humming. The song. My heart skipped a beat as I listened, each note etching itself into my mind like a warning. I wasn't alone. I looked around, but there was nothing, only shadows moving with the wind. But the song continued, and I knew it was closer than I thought. With no other choice, I started walking, following the sound of the song. I didn't know what I would find, but I couldn't stay there waiting for the man to find me. Every step brought me closer to the source of the song, and with each step, the fear grew stronger. Finally, I reached a clearing in the darkness. And there, in the center, was Robert. He was standing still, eyes closed, humming the song I had heard in the bathroom. The scene was surreal, almost dreamlike. But when I saw what was in front of him, my heart stopped. The man with the knife was there. What I hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see, was that the man wasn't alone. There were bodies at his feet. It was a couple, a man and a woman with pale skin and clothes soaked in blood. Their eyes were open, but they didn't see. The woman's throat was slit, and the man had multiple stab wounds in his torso. They were the motel's caretakers. There was no doubt in my mind. The man with the knife looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I would never forget. Pure madness. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was trapped in paralyzing terror, unable to move. Robert kept humming, as if he didn't know what was happening, as if he were in a trance. The man raised the knife, and I knew my time was running out. I had to do something now. With monumental effort, I forced myself to move. I ran to Robert, grabbed his arm, and shook him hard. "Robert, wake up, we have to go." His humming stopped, and his eyes finally focused on me. But before he could say anything, I felt a sharp pain in my arm. The knife. The man had attacked. The pain was unbearable, but the fear was stronger. Robert and I staggered back, and before the man could strike again, I pushed him with all my strength. He fell to the ground, and we ran. We ran through the darkness, not looking back, with the sound of our ragged breaths and the deafening pounding of our hearts in our ears. We ran until my legs couldn't take it anymore, and finally, when I saw the flickering lights of the motel in the distance, I knew we had escaped, for now. When we reached the car, Robert's trembling hands fumbled to find the keys. He pulled them from his pocket with a cry of relief. But when he tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The car wouldn't start. "Come on, damn car, come on," he shouted, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. The fear and desperation were almost palpable in the air. We knew we didn't have much time before the man found us. I couldn't believe we had come this far only to be trapped here. Suddenly, the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, Robert slammed on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. The motel faded into the distance, and with it, the horror we had experienced. As we drove, the pain in my arm intensified, and I saw the blood soaking through my shirt. We had survived, but just barely. Robert looked in the rearview mirror, and his eyes widened. "It can't be. Look!" he exclaimed, pointing down the road behind us. I turned slowly, dreading what I would see. But there was no one. The road was empty, deserted, and the motel was no longer in sight. We had escaped. Finally, we reached the city, and the relief was so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. We headed to the hospital, where I got my arm treated, and then we went to the police station to report what had happened. The officers listened to our story with skepticism, but when we mentioned the motel and what we had seen there, their expressions changed. One of them took us to a private room and closed the door. "What you saw," began the officer, his voice grave, "was a serial killer we've been searching for months. He's known as the Knife Killer. He's murdered several people in roadside motels like that one, always leaving behind a gruesome scene." My hands trembled as I listened. I couldn't believe we had been so close to death, that we had escaped by such a narrow margin. And the girl. "The song," I whispered, unable to shake the memory of that haunting melody. The officer nodded, his expression somber. That's something we've heard before from other survivors. No one knows why, but there always seems to be a song that heralds his arrival. Robert and I looked at each other in silence, both knowing that though we had survived, we would never forget that night. We would never forget the song. And as we drove home in silence, I knew that something inside me had changed forever. We had faced death, and though we had won, something dark and terrifying would follow us for the rest of our lives. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now you're going to hear the story of restless souls at the window. Road trips had always been our favorite way to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, the sense of freedom that came from leaving behind skyscrapers and venturing onto rural roads, where the sky, stretched infinitely over fields and mountains, had always been a balm for our souls. This time was no different. We had planned a family getaway, just my wife, Claire, our daughter, Sophie, and me. A peaceful trip to the mountains, far from everything. The car moved steadily along the lonely road as night began to envelop the landscape. Fatigue was setting into my bones, but the sound of Sophie's laughter in the back seat, playing with her favorite doll, kept me alert. Claire beside me was lost in thought, gazing at the horizon that was slowly disappearing. "How much longer, honey?" she asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at the dashboard clock. "Not much. Maybe another 30 minutes, but we could stop at the next motel we see. It's not worth driving any further in the dark." Claire nodded, and I felt her warm, reassuring hand on mine. She had always been my anchor, the person who kept me grounded, even in the most difficult moments. Then, as if fate had heard our prayers, a rusty sign appeared in the distance. "Scenic View Motel, 2 kilometers." The name made me smile. How ironic, I thought, a name so idyllic for a place that, at first glance, looked anything but welcoming. "What do you think?" I asked Claire. "I think it would be better to stop here," she replied, her tone betraying her exhaustion. "Sophie looks tired too." I looked at our daughter, now curled up against her seat, her eyes heavy with sleep. I nodded and took the exit that led us to the motel. The building emerged from the darkness like a relic from another time, with a facade that had seen better days. The neon lights of the sign flickered intermittently, and the parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of old cars that looked like they had been there for a long time. I turned off the engine, and silence took over the place. The air was still and the feeling of isolation was almost palpable. Claire got out of the car first, stretching her arms and surveying the surroundings with a doubtful expression. "It's a bit desolate, isn't it?" she said in a low voice. "I know, but it's just for one night," I responded, trying to sound more optimistic than I really felt. "We'll be on our way again tomorrow." Sophie woke up as I lifted her out of the car, and we headed to the reception. The door creaked as it opened, and inside we were greeted by a small bell that chimed weakly. The reception desk was covered in dust, and behind it, an elderly man with a serious expression and a white beard that contrasted with his weathered skin sat watching us. "Good evening," I greeted, trying to sound friendly. "Do you have a room available for the night?" The man looked at us with tired eyes, as if he were used to seeing fleeting travelers like us. "Yes, we have rooms. Number 8 is clean and ready. That'll be $30. Claire pulled the money from her purse as the man handed us a rusty key attached to a tag with the room number. As we were about to leave, the receptionist stopped us with an unexpected comment. "It's best not to look too closely out the window," he said, not taking his eyes off the old television flickering in the corner of the reception. "Sometimes the shadows play tricks." We stopped in our tracks, and Claire raised her eyebrows at me. "Excuse me?" she asked, a mix of disbelief and nervousness in her voice. The man looked up at us for the first time since we arrived. His eyes were dark, and there was a glint of something in them that I couldn't identify. "Just a piece of advice, ma'am," he said, before returning his attention to the TV as if he hadn't said anything unusual. We didn't respond. There was something about his tone that made me feel uneasy, but I decided not to dwell on it. Maybe he was just a lonely man who enjoyed playing on the fears of travelers. However, his words echoed in my mind as we made our way to room number 8. The room was small and simple, with a double bed and a single bed against the wall. The decor was outdated, with wallpaper that had once been vibrant, but was now faded and cracked. A large window looked out onto the parking lot, covered by thick burgundy curtains. Sophie, still sleepy, climbed onto the single bed without a word, and Claire began unpacking the essentials for the night. Meanwhile, I inspected the room, trying to shake off the strange feeling the receptionist's comment had left me with. "I'm going to take a shower," I announced, hoping the hot water would clear my mind. As the steam filled the small bathroom, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadows the receptionist had mentioned. Something about his warning had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I found myself recalling stories I had heard as a child, tales of spirits and apparitions that haunted abandoned places, waiting to trap the unwary. I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. It was just an old motel in the middle of nowhere, nothing more. I emerged from the bathroom feeling somewhat better. The warmth of the water had calmed my nerves. I found Claire sitting on the bed, reading a book while Sophie slept soundly beside her. I smiled and walked over to kiss her on the forehead. "Feeling better?" she asked, closing the book and looking at me with those eyes that always seemed to know more than I was saying. "Yeah, I just needed some hot water," I replied, though I knew she could see through my lie. Something was still bothering me, but I didn't want to worry her. Claire sighed, and I noticed she was looking toward the window. "Don't you think what that man said was a bit strange?" "He was probably joking," I said, trying to downplay it, although inside I felt a growing discomfort. "Don't think too much about it." She nodded, but her expression remained concerned. I decided to change the subject, and soon we were discussing our plans for the next day. But even as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a while, Claire went to bed, and I turned off the lights. Darkness settled in quickly, and the silence of the place became more apparent. Only the soft whir of the ceiling fan broke the stillness, and the faint sound of Sophie's breathing reassured me. I lay down, trying to focus on sleep, but my thoughts kept returning to the receptionist's words. What had he really meant? The shadows at the window. I couldn't understand why that particular phrase had triggered so much fear in me. Finally, fatigue began to overcome me, and my eyelids grew heavy. Just as I was about to drift off, I felt something. A presence. Something was wrong. I opened my eyes suddenly and saw Claire sitting up in bed, staring intently at the window. Her face was pale and her hands trembled slightly. "Claire, what's wrong?" I whispered, trying not to wake Sophie. She didn't respond immediately, but her eyes were fixed on the window, as if she were seeing something I couldn't. I got up and approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Claire?" I repeated, more urgently this time. Finally, she turned to me, and what I saw in her eyes chilled me to the bone. It was fear, pure and visceral fear. "There's something outside," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I saw it. It moved, right behind the curtains." My heart raced, and all the receptionist's warnings came rushing back to me like a storm. Yet I forced myself to stay calm. I had to be rational. I couldn't let fear take over. "I'm going to take a look," I said, though every part of me screamed not to. Claire grabbed my arm tightly. "No, don't. I don't want you to go near that window." The desperation in her voice almost made me stop, but I knew I couldn't let fear dominate us. I had to protect my family. With my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, I approached the window slowly. The heavy curtains swayed slightly, and I could see a faint glow of light from the parking lot lamp. I took a deep breath and pulled the curtain aside a bit to look outside. The parking lot was empty, just as it had been before. The old truck was still there, and there were no signs of movement. I stared for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. There was nothing there. But then, just as I was about to turn away, something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow. It passed quickly, as if sliding along the edge of the light, and disappeared into the darkness. I felt a chill run through my body, but I forced myself to look closer. Maybe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. "What did you see?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. I turned to her, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's nothing. Maybe it was just a shadow of some tree moving in the wind. But Claire didn't seem convinced, and truthfully, neither was I. I knew what I had seen, or at least I thought I did. But I didn't want to alarm her any more than she already was. We decided to leave the bathroom light on and tried to go back to sleep. However, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. I could feel the tension in every fiber of my being, and every little sound made me jump. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and eventually sleep overtook me. I didn't know how long I slept, but I was abruptly awakened by a muffled scream. "Dad!" Sophie's voice, full of fear, made me jump out of bed. I turned to see her sitting up, tears in her eyes, pointing toward the window. My heart stopped. "There's someone there," she whispered, her voice broken by panic. I saw a face in the window. I rushed to her and hugged her, feeling her small body trembling against mine. I looked at Claire, who was also pale and terrified. "There's no one there, sweetheart," I told her, though my words felt hollow. I knew something was out there. I could feel it. But I couldn't let Sophie see my fear. I had to stay calm for her, for Claire. I approached the window again, determined to face whatever was out there. When I pulled the curtain aside, the parking lot was dark and empty, just as before. But this time something else caught my attention. A figure. Far away, barely visible in the dim light, but definitely there. It moved slowly toward the back of the motel. I felt a knot in my stomach, and all the ghost stories I'd ever heard flooded back into my mind. It couldn't be real, but it was. I was seeing it. I turned to Claire and Sophie, both waiting for my reaction with evident fear. I couldn't lie to them, not now. "We're leaving," I said with determination. "I don't care what time it is, we're leaving right now." Claire nodded, and Sophie clung to me as we began to pack our things hurriedly. I didn't want to stay in that place for another second. The fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was a primal, visceral fear. We left the room with our hearts in our throats, and the cold night air hit us hard. The parking lot was still deserted, and everything was silent except for the sound of our hurried footsteps. When we reached the car, we loaded our things quickly and got in. I took one last look at room number 8, and a shiver ran down my spine when I saw the curtains in the window move slightly, as if someone were watching us from inside. I didn't wait to find out. I started the engine and sped away from the motel as fast as I could. We drove in silence, and the fear began to dissipate as we put more distance between ourselves and the place. But the silence was broken by Sophie's voice. "Dad, who were those people?" The question hit me like a hammer. "What people, Sophie?" "The people at the window," she said with the innocence of a child who doesn't understand the horror of what she has seen. "There were 3, but they didn't look happy." I felt a chill in my chest and looked at Claire, who returned my gaze with the same fear reflected in her eyes. I knew Sophie wasn't making it up. She had seen something we hadn't. Restless souls, perhaps. We drove in silence for hours, until we finally reached a small town at dawn. We stopped at a cafe, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. I decided we couldn't continue our trip without knowing more about what we had left behind. With my phone finally getting a signal, I searched for information about the Scenic View Motel. What I found left me cold. A few years ago, the motel had been the scene of a gruesome discovery. A clandestine grave had been found in the back, with the bodies of several people who had disappeared in the area. No one ever found out who was responsible, and the investigations went cold over time. But there was one thing all the witnesses mentioned: the shadows they saw in the windows, especially in room number 8. I closed the phone and looked at Claire and Sophie. I didn't tell them what I had discovered. There was no need to relive the terror. The important thing was that we were safe, and that we would never return to that place. As we prepared to continue our journey, I couldn't help but think about what the receptionist had said. The shadows play tricks, but I knew they weren't just shadows. They were the souls of those who never found rest, trapped in a cursed place. And as we drove away from that town, I knew that, although we had left the motel behind, a part of us would always carry the memory of that night. A night when we faced something we should never have seen.